Marco Rubio of Florida. He's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee and vice chairman of the Select Committee on Intelligence. Nobody is immune, Senator, from second guessing and criticism, both hawks and doves. I can make both cases for you. I can say that history has shown us that if you don't take really strong measures early on, that really bad things can eventually happen. And they point to some what would be war crimes already, civilians dying for no reason, that we're not really doing anything to stop convoys being, or bombing. Any of this, just take your pick of what's going on over there. Some of the stuff we could stop. Also enforcing a no-fly zone. People are saying that we should do that, but all of it makes you think that we could get into a shooting war with Russia, and no one knows what would happen there. So what is the right tactic right now in terms of how hawkish or how dovish we should be?
Well, I think a couple things. The first is I think we have to recognize we have witnessed horrifying things, and we're going to see some really horrifying things here over the next few days. We just are. I mean, these Russian forces are now targeting civilian areas. They're firing with very powerful munitions against areas where, children are and women are and the elderly are, just civilian populations. They're committing war crimes, and I think those need to be documented, by the way, because the people doing that are going to have to stand up to justice one day. There's going to be whether it's a new Nuremberg-type process or what have you, someone's going to have to answer for this down the road. The second is, obviously, we have to look, there's no way Putin wins. Okay, there's no win here. I mean, he may defeat the Ukraine military. He may occupy multiple cities in the country, but he'll never win because he's going to be faced with one of two choices. Either A, he's going to have to occupy a country where 40 million people don't want him there and are continuing to attack them, or B, he's going to get up and leave behind a puppet government, which the Ukrainians will quickly overthrow and they'll never accept. So he's either headed for a quagmire or he's headed for, a puppet government that's going to get overthrown the minute he's no longer there. Either way, it's not a win. So we've got to continue to impose a price on him for doing this. This has to be the most expensive adventurism in the modern history of the world, because if it isn't, he'll keep doing it. And if it isn't, other countries will do it as well. The world needs to see, and Putin needs to learn, that if he does this kind of thing, the price they will pay is devastating, and some of that's already happening. I mean, look, a week, you guys are the financial experts. Where's Russia's economy headed? A week from now, they're headed to third world territory in terms of the damage that they're suffering. They're completely isolated. They can't fly anywhere. They've got planes stuck all over the world. They can't even fly. So they've got massive problems. They're already paying a very heavy price. We need to make sure those things are sustained. I want to make one last point. I think it's important, no matter what happens in Ukraine, that there always be a legitimate government, be it in a rump state or in a part of Ukraine or in exile, that we recognize and that we support, that we continue to provide logistical support and weapons so that insurgency will continue to inflict damage on the Russians until those occupiers leave.
Senator, I guess just ask you specifically, should we, it's not a NATO country, obviously, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world, and I'm not arguing Bill Ackman's point here that we should intervene, but when we see atrocities being committed and we know it's happening, just because it's not a NATO country, why does it mean that we shouldn't intercede to protect people that are being harmed? Why do we have to, is that just strategically what we need to do to not make things worse? And Putin must not know that, which doesn't put us in a great position of strength.
Well, what we're seeing now illustrates and shows us why North Korea has nuclear weapons and why Iran wants them. Because when you're a nuclear weapons power, the options that your adversaries have against you are quite limited. If a shooting war between NATO or the United States and Russian troops puts us in World War III. That's just a fact. I mean, they could deploy tactical nuclear weapons. We would have to respond, and I mean, that's the problem, right? It's the nuclear weapons. That's why countries want them.
Agreed.
That's the same problem with a no-fly zone. So it's heartbreaking to watch. I think the world is trying to do everything it can to support Ukraine in its fight and to punish Russia. This is taking a huge bite out of them.
We're not doing everything we can. And you talked about the Russian economy. The Russian economy would be much worse off if it was unable to export oil, because at $100, and we're not doing that. That's been conveniently left out of the sanctions, and Europe's in a bind. But Germany looks like it's ready to to do what's necessary to try to make a difference here, not thinking about their own energy problems. Should we do that? Should we cut off any export of Russian oil? We can't.
Well, I think we can and we should, and commensurate with policy announcements by this administration that for example, that we're going to produce more oil and natural gas. I believe just last week, the president issued an executive order banning building any more LNG terminals to make it harder to export natural gas. Today, we're producing, I think it's 1.3 million barrels of oil less than we were pre-pandemic. These high oil prices, combined with the lifting of these restrictions, would allow there to be greater exploration. It's not from one day to the next, but the point is the U.S. needs to get back to that point that we were in 2019 and 2020 when we were exporting more than we were importing. It would have a net effect on the global economy, on the global oil production in the world. And I think that would give us the possibility and the opportunity to be able to do some of the things you're saying. So we've got to do that in conjunction with announcing what you're saying. You're absolutely right. I mean, we cannot continue. This is the ultimate leverage. One of the two reasons why Putin thinks he can get away with this, number one is oil and gas, and number two is nuclear weapons. We've got to take one of those two away.
What would you like to hear tonight? What do you expect to hear tonight?
Well, what I'd like to hear, I won't hear, and that is the president announcing that America is going to get back into the business of aggressively producing oil and natural gas and exporting it as well, becoming a player in the global market, that he's going to roll back some of these restrictions that they've put in place on natural gas, on new exploration in Alaska and in Texas on production, that our goal is to get back to that early 2020, late 2019 production aims and metrics that we were hitting, and that we're going to do that in conjunction with a gradual reduction and ultimate elimination of imports of Russian oil. I'd love to see him say it. I don't think he can or will, because the radical left wing of his party would go nuts. They would go bonkers if he did that.
Senator, two questions. Obviously, there's a whole number of abandoned oil rigs in the U.S. that could be used that aren't being used, even beyond drilling elsewhere. What do you say to the business leaders, both in the energy industry and beyond, that have effectively taken on the issue of ESG and climate and are moving away from oil and gas?
Well, I think they're responding to political pressure both globally and here in the United States in doing that. And here's what I would say is a couple things. Oil is at close to $100 a barrel right now, so now's a pretty good time to get back in that business. Second is I have no problem with renewables. I have no problem with carbon capture. I have no problem with being able to find alternative ways of generating energy. My problem is if you push an economy to do that before the technology to do it catches up, all you're doing is inflicting pain on your economy. All these things, all this self-flagellation that we're doing in the West, meanwhile, China is actively funding coal plants in China and all over the world. All over the world. Russia is actively and aggressively producing fossil fuels. So I have no problem with ultimately finding a way to technologically use less fossil fuels and move away from them as an alternative. That would be fantastic. If someone can figure out how to make a car run on water or whatever, that'd be fantastic.
Would you support
awesome.
Nuclear energy?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it can be done safely, as we prove every single day in this country and around the world. And it's one of the big mistakes some of the countries in Europe have made. They've walked away from nuclear energy, which is a clean source of energy. Obviously, the issue there is always where do you put the waste? But the truth of the matter is it is a very clean way to generate energy, very reliable, and it can be done safely, as we do every single day in this country in multiple sites.
We know Putin went to the Olympics. He and she are prior to China distancing itself a little bit. We heard that China probably was aiding and abetting here. So is that the case? Do you think that they shouldn't be? We shouldn't blame China. We should let them sort of just stand aside and say, "Hey, we think that there should be restraint here." And I mean, they're basically. Okay at this point, and they shouldn't be. They should, if they have any leverage, and they do now, because they're a big part of Putin and what he's able to do economically depends on China. They're not helping. They're not helping to the extent that they should. Well, maybe they should be sanctioned.
Well, I think that for the Chinese, there's a couple things. First of all, I would remind the world, this is the country that wants to become the most powerful country in the world, and they're fine with the slaughter, the indiscriminate slaughter of innocents in Ukraine. The second thing, I think for China, this serves three purposes. The first is in their mind, they're going to need Russia to support them one day when they move on Taiwan. They've got their own territorial claims. The second is China is supportive of this idea that we need to have a new global order, not the old global order, but a new one in which great powers like Russia or like China have spheres of influence where they get to tell their neighbors what to do and make them vassal tributary states. And I think that the third challenge for China in all this is their own record of what they do to people. I mean, it's hard for them to talk about the indiscriminate killing of human beings and so forth, of innocents, when they're putting Uyghur Muslims in work and death camps in their own country. So there's a lot at play here. Look, they're complying with a lot of these sanctions because at the end of the day, they don't want it to splash back on them. But there's no doubt that they're treading very carefully because they intend to do this one day. This is what they intend to do one day in Taiwan, and when they do, they want to make sure that Russia's supporting them.
Hey, Senator, I don't want to relitigate the history. You've been very outspoken, obviously, about China and China's leadership and what's happened there. The head of the GOP, former President Trump, has made some comments about Putin over the years, and more recently, he has
so much good stuff to talk about. What, they're obsessed with.
And
go ahead, let me hear this one.
You haven't been.
Don't you want to talk about something else?
No, because you know what? There's a midterm coming. And
all right, we'll ask the question. We're going to run out of time. You won't get your question in. Come on.
I know. We just did it with Kevin Brady yesterday, and you're going to get the same answer from him.
No, you won't. Here's very simple, okay? I heard that interview, okay? I'm not going off the press reports. I heard the interview. I didn't hear him say that. I heard what I heard is a guy who was being sarcastic, right? He was saying, oh, look at this guy. He's a genius, this, that, and the other. The problem is that people think Donald Trump is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He doesn't talk like that. He doesn't talk like some analyst at a think tank. He doesn't talk like most people in Washington. But right after he said all that stuff, okay, and I don't agree with everything he's ever said about Russia, but right after he said that stuff that people are pointing to, he talked about how we need to impose crushing sanctions and how he warned Putin not to do this.
He sold weapons to Ukraine, which Obama didn't. How many times can you get triggered about a comment?
Well, let me tell you something else about that.
No, about Trump.
It's the former
Let me tell you something else about that.
He says stuff. He's crazy. He says stuff like that. You know that.
Who has been supportive of Putin.
Can I say something else about that? Okay, I remember, I don't know if it was 2014 or early 2015, that we had a bunch of senators over to the vice president's house, at that time, Vice President Biden. And I remember specifically asking Vice President Biden, why do we not send defensive weaponry to Ukraine? And his answer was, because we're afraid they'll use it and start a bigger and broader conflict. So the Obama administration did not fund any sort of weaponry. I remember the Ukrainians used to complain, stop sending us blankets and MREs. We need, anti-tank missiles and the like. The Trump administration, for everything people want to talk about rhetorically, they did start the arming and equipping of Ukraine. And if it wasn't for what the Trump administration did and laid the groundwork for, there's no way Ukraine would still be able to hold out today.
Senator, fair to say, though, would you prefer that the former president not use language like that gets taken and twisted or done whatever and put out there to the rest of the world? You're right. He's not Council on Foreign Relations, but people listen when he speaks. He's the former president.
Well, again, I think it's unfortunate, but basically we're at a point now where it doesn't matter. It's not just him. I mean, Mike Pompeo made a comment. He wasn't calling Putin a genius out of admiration. What he was saying is, look, this is a crafty guy, okay, that we have to respect his craftiness because he's an adversary. But that got twisted into somehow Mike Pompeo is pro-Russia when he has a long history of being strong and on Putin going back to Congress. Unfortunately, we live in a moment like this, and maybe we have for a long time, where you got to be careful with every word you say because, a media narrative will be created against you. And obviously your political opponents are going to spin it that way.
It's so obvious. It is one of his ridiculous, ill-conceived remarks about, we got Sleepy Joe here and, Putin's smart. Of course he's going to take advantage of Joe Biden. Trump says stuff like that all the time, but what does he do? They sold weapons. They sold weapons to Ukraine, which Obama did not do. So, but it gets us nowhere. George Stephanopoulos, you saw him do it. He asked it like 8 times. He was Clinton's guy. That's like putting Steve Bannon on the ABC Morning News and having him interview Democrats.
Come on.
Put Steve Bannon on and have him interview.
These are fair questions to ask.
Okay. Like 8 times from poor Tom Cotton. What's Tom Cotton got to do with what Trump says? Or what's Rubio have to do with what Trump says?
He's a senior member of the Republican leadership.
God almighty.
President Trump, former President Trump.
Do you have a picture of Trump above your bed? Did you ever forget about him?
I think you might.
Did I bring him up? Did I bring him up?